A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, everybody, we're here with James Pigeon Fielder, to be known from this point on as Pigeon, who's a Colorado State University political scientist who researches interpersonal trust and emergent political processes through cyber-based interaction and through tabletop and live-action gaming as natural experiments. He's also the chief operating officer for role-playing company Mobius Worlds Publishing and consults on organizational wargaming, crisis response exercises, and scenario planning. Pigeon does a whole lot, and we are excited to have him. Welcome to the show, Pigeon.
Happy to be here.
All right. You know, so this idea of talking about the ethics of politics, right? It really might seem like a weird topic to a lot of people. If we were talking about ethics in real world politics, it really wouldn't be that confusing, right? I mean, we could talk about political corruption, potential conflicts of interest from the people in the government, responsibilities that the government has to the people, responsibilities political parties have to voters, issues in political advertising. There's a lot of stuff, but all that stuff is real. Video games are fictional worlds where things are really different. So when you talk about politics in video games, Pigeon, what do you have in mind?
All right, I have two thoughts. There is first the individual player as a political actor. So giving themselves into the game, embodying a character in their game, and then behaving politically, carrying out their agency inside of this world. It could be Dungeons and Dragons to go kill the Foozle. It can be in EVE Online, where they're part of a larger corporation. But so it's individual. And most common finding I've found, and this ties into dovetails, if you will, with sociology showing that players will emerge from the game more confident and then more likely to interact with real life organizations. So I would say to behave politically. So that's one angle. Second angle is then literally how do players form governing bodies inside of games. So maybe a tabletop game where they build a country, they build a non-government organization like a fighters guild or whatnot, or in a video game where they'll form a corporation on EVE Online or form their own guild inside of World of Warcraft. And so there you see how committed players are to the group and how they conform to what that institution stands for. And they will project quite a bit of individual, how should I say? They will dedicate themselves quite powerfully and quite strongly to these institutions. And in fact, I had a paper published in Simulation and Gaming on the Battle of B5RB in EVE Online. It just came out in seeing how players all over the world dropped everything they were doing, called in sick to work, didn't go to class, stayed up all night to be part of their corporation in the game to fight the other corporation. And that's a level of motivation and drive I'd like to see in real world, not just in a game. So,
Right.
So yeah, basically individual activity and then forming groups. Those are the two kind of angles.
That was that huge battle in EVE, right? Like the biggest battle ever?
Right. So at the time it was the most players in the biggest battle.
Right.
I'm pretty positive they've had larger ones since, but that was still unique in that it was the largest fought ever in any game online, and it was the first one to have measurable economic damage. So,
right. In the real world economic damage,
Yes.
not in-game economic damage.
correct.
Because EVE Online has also had issues with in-game economic problems caused by this kind of... This is where...
It affects the real economy because people aren't going to work.
Right.
Right.
That's amazing. And measurable, which means it's not just a handful of people doing stuff. Yeah, that's amazing.
Pigeon, it's kind of weird to, you're talking about groups. It's easy to understand the idea of political actor in a game, right? You can go into a game, you can have politics of various powerful groups in the game that you might have to deal with. What is the organizations, like the example you just gave us about Eve, right? You join an organization and you have a commitment, motivation to it. What does that have to do with what we call politics?
Generally speaking, if politics are about how governments form or how people build political institutions, that includes not just states, but also non-government organizations. So a corporation, both in the real world and in an in-game parlance, is a non-government organization. An organization founded by people, private citizens, to carry out some sort of objective. Real world, Amazon's formed to sell us a whole bunch of tchotchkes, or Amnesty International forms to protect human rights. In the game, it would be to advance the cause, the cause of the organization, and it could be something as simple as we're here to get loot and make sure we enrich ourselves.
Right. I want to spend most of our time today talking about multiplayer games, right? Because that's where we're going to get these groups and everything. But let's at least start a little bit by focusing on the single player experience. It seems to me that a single player in the world, like let's say Skyrim, right, can react to the political situation of that world. So you get an option, right? You're going to be the Empire or the Rebels, right? And then in a game like the game Orwell, where essentially the government hires you to quote unquote help fight terrorism, or maybe spy on your own people, depending on how you look at it, you get some choices in the game where you got to decide how much to help the government with the secret surveillance, or maybe how much to help people be free from the government. There you're obviously, playing in kind of political situation. When I talked about justice a couple of weeks ago with one of my classes, and one of my students said, I wouldn't care at all about justice in a video game. It's just a game. Right. Obviously, this is not how a lot of players feel about justice, even in a world where where it's a single player experience. Do you know anything about how players approach decisions like this? Like there's Empire or Rebels in single player world?
Right. Yeah. So you will have certain players who are able to very well separate themselves from this is a game and I'm not present in the game. This is a character. And they'll engage with the narrative without any sense of a remorse or joy or whatever. But then you'll have other players who will have a visceral response to, do I join the Stormcloaks or do I join the Empire? What do they stand for?
Right.
So speaking for myself, I know I'm an anecdotal example. I have a very visceral distaste in Skyrim to playing the Empire. I always side with the Stormcloaks, because for me it actually matters, and that's actually a key point right there. Single player games, be it Orwell, be it Papers, Please, be it Jalopy, or This War of Mine, players have to know that their choices matter. That's what's the kicker. That's when they walk away from the game feeling like they've learned something or they've engaged emotionally with the narrative. I dare say, what do I say? You don't want them to be railroaded or pigeonholed. I just threw that in there. Just this very morning, a student of mine came up to talk to me and was talking about playing Cyberpunk 2077. And he said, playing through all the choices up to one of the ends, I'm not going to have spoilers here. And he told me what ending he played to, and he said he walked away with it. It's still haunting him. He won it 2 weeks ago, and he's still thinking about all the choices he made. What could he have done different? And all the choices leading to that point mattered.
Right. Yeah, and that's just juicy goodness, right? Because not only is that really interesting to happen in the real time, like that's that engagement that we're trying to get in all of our games.
Yeah.
But it also leads him back to playing it again potentially.
Yes.
Or telling his friends to play it, or otherwise re-engaging with the game, which is great.
Yes. I will cite two specific single player examples that in a way violate this rule, like the somewhat railroad players that do a certain outcome, but I think they're emotionally powerful enough that it still matters. One being Spec Ops: The Line, where the player follows the descent into madness of a character in the game.
Right.
And that's intentional. They do have some agency, but it's intentional. So they approach the game knowing that.
Right.
This is just one of the set pieces in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which was called the No Russian setting. Right. And that's where you actually played through a mass killing inside of an airport. Oof. And you were a soldier killing civilians. So yes, they played through it. I mean, this is very controversial. A lot of countries censored this out. But the designers said, and actually I can't remember the fellow's name, said that was intentional. You wanted a sense of having this visceral experience, seeing what your opponents did. So when you come play the good guy, if you will, it's not just narrative. You know exactly what happened because you did it.
Right. You were there.
When you said I never thought of playing, as the Empire, it's I wonder if this is part of the political bias of, let's say, living in a society where the word empire is a dirty word. We are a society, we are freedom-loving society. Empire means control. Empire means oppression, right? And so, I never remotely thought of joining the Empire in that game. But of course, Empire means order. Empire means stability.
Right. I sort of feel like the negative connotation on Empire has come about in our lifetimes. And probably, got a big kick by Star Wars.
Interesting. I think before, we were talking about the Soviet Empire, I think before that, but I think Star Wars really nails it. That's most young people's image of Empire at this point is, the evil Empire. But at the same time,
stormtroopers and faceless enemies and
At the same time, I think of when the Roman Empire fell, not a good thing for most people, right?
That's a good point. That is a very good point, because I can approach it as a political scientist having a personal, visceral response to being a member of the Empire. But I do know, you're right. The Empire is stable, has a strong economy. Everyone's cooperating to ensure that everyone's safe, secure. And it's like, who doesn't want that? Side note, when I applied to teach at the Air Force Academy, I compared the national security policy of Iran with the national security policy of the Empire from Star Wars.
Oh.
And to make a lot of contrast, but one of them was, who doesn't like order? Like the Empire, just seen through the films, looks they got a 401k plan, the economy's good, GI Bill, everything's good.
Right.
Without the films overlook the other Orwellian aspects of being in the Empire, but looking at it just from the outside, surface inspection, it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with it.
Right.
And that hegemon does provide that security to ensure people have good jobs, gas is good, has a good price, that sort of thing. So,
so to go back to this choice that we as the single player have to make, right? We're taking sides here on, we have a vision of how, let's say, political society is supposed to be or how we want it to be. And let's say, even if we recognize on some level, the Empire builds stability, we're going to get a lot more meaning if we're involved in the game in a way that connects us to the way power is, the way we would like power to operate in our world. Is that the idea?
Yes, absolutely. You have that normative sense of, this is the way I think things ought to be.
Yep.
In this world.
Let's move on to multiplayer games, because I figured that's where we're going to be.
I think that leads us very neatly into how do we then band together to bring these normative ideas into our games.
Right. We come into a game already bringing our normative ideas, and now we've got a bunch of people with different ideas in a world where we have different factions. So what are some of the ways that politics can become a factor? So in any way in multiplayer games?
The big one is it could be World of Warcraft, where the EULA governs how the world works, all the way to nullsec and EVE Online. It's just you give players the opportunity to form groups, and those groups are allowed to be persistent. That right there is a government institution in Petri dish form, and that's basically it. I'm going to throw out here a term that Ian Bogas coined in 2007 in Persuasive Game, which he called procedural rhetoric. It applies to single-player games too, but in multiplayer, it's the sense of how then players as a group learn to navigate. I'm sorry, let me back up. How the rules from the designers govern what the players can do, but then in turn, how the players try to press the boundaries about, well, what can we get away with inside of this procedural rhetoric, or developing this narrative as they go within the confines of a design structure.
Can we get some examples of that? Let's see. So is the whole thing the politics of the game, or is the way that the players are reacting to the structure that's the politics of the game?
Right. It's a bit of both, and I would say it depends on the game.
Okay.
So something like World of Warcraft, where yes, the world might change in some way based on what your character does, but it's largely scripted. Like Blizzard says, this is how the game will behave, and there's not much you as individual players can do about it. In that case, then, in the absence of agency against the game, you could see then guilds form to carry out political activity against each other instead, like raids against guilds in PvP format. I remember that big raid in, what year was it? Where a funeral, an in-game funeral for a real person in real life was overrun by a guild because they saw it as being free. Like, you didn't protect yourself. I'm sorry about that. In contrast to, again, my favorite nullsec in EVE Online, where there is no limits. Like, as long as players know how to play the game, the developer does not step in any way to tell the players what they can do.
Right. Nullsec and EVE Online is zero security. It's an area of the game in which the police, the in-game police do not go. So it's a Wild West. It's the Wild West of EVE Online.
Yes. The only procedural rhetoric there really is the limits on what type of ships are available, like user interface, the kind of like how the game functions. But otherwise, no restriction on how you can play otherwise.
I have an interesting story from the mid 90s. I was involved in an ongoing vampire LARP.
Ah, sweet.
And you're my people. I know you. And we had decided that this world, this fictional world that this takes place is, we're all playing vampires, and there's this hidden society, and it's all very political. And there's all these different factions, and there's factions within the factions, and so it's super political. But we had decided as players that we didn't like the rule system as it was, and we needed a rule system that didn't require so much GM intervention. And so we got together out of character with all these different players, and we started working on these rules, and we realized that we kept having these we kept coming up like against each other on certain rules, and we realized that there was some of us had come into this setting our characters aside, and some of us had not, and some of us had come in with the assumption that this was in character, or at least partially in character, and that we should be working to tweak the rules to advantage our faction.
Oh, I see. So you're crossing the magic circle there.
Yeah. And so it was very strange when we realized that we weren't all on the same page about what we were doing.
Interesting.
And so so that's where this as players we were then changing the rules, and some of us were thinking about the way this would affect our players, our characters.
Let me ask this. So when we think about the ethics of political activity in real life, right? It's kind of obvious. I've already kind of mentioned a bunch of issues, right, that come up that are ethical issues, right? What would be questionable behavior, potentially unethical behavior of political groups in a game like WoW? Right? Is this just a game, or are there things that are really morally questionable for one group in WoW to do to another?
Okay, so this is where I'm going to nerd out again. And apologies if this term has come up before I have listened to episodes of this podcast, so so on top of, I see that Shlomo talked about the magic circle. That's great. So I'm going to extend that to presence, which is specific to video games, where in the magic circle, what you're doing is you're projecting your identity onto your avatar inside the screen. It could be anything from a squiggly line in Dwarf Fortress to a fully articulated character in World of Warcraft or whatnot. The problem is when you're present in the game like that, anything that happens to your character is as if it's actually happened to you personally. So let's say individual level, if somebody assaults somebody else in the game, the player is going to feel like they've been assaulted. And there have been, I don't know if cases of virtual sexual assault where, oh yeah, people might, but it's just a game. It is not for the participants. For the person who has been assaulted, sexually assaulted in the game, psychologically and emotionally, it has actually happened to them. There's plenty of cases of that happening where people now have to be counseled in real life because that happened to them. Now, fast forward to a whole group. Let's say an actual group is formed entirely by white nationalists, or entirely by men, entirely by women, entirely by a certain ethnic group. If that guild starts attacking other players in another guild entirely based on their real or perceived background, that is as if they're being actually assaulted in real life. That's bad news. That is bad news.
So, yeah, the comparison obviously here is going to raise some eyebrows, right?
Well, and I think it's also fair to say that different people experience this slightly differently. Like how much of their identity they've put into this token, this avatar token of themselves, varies from person to person. Now, some people can play WoW and not have a lot of their own emotional investment in that, where other people have a lot of emotional investment in that.
Right. So I can imagine, I can see it. So, let's say this was straightforwardly, very explicitly, a racist attack in the game, right? Against, based on grounds, I might not feel like I was, a victim of a racist crime or attack in the game, but I might feel like, oh my God, it's just so tragic that racism is even in these games, right? And I'm sure there's lots of people, in between that. I'm assuming sexism would be another one, kind of anything like this, any group identity, besides straight up group identity, right? So this is one group trying to disenfranchise another group simply because of their identity, and I'm assuming their identity is not being an orc, or
Well, I think it's because of real world identities. I don't think that the fictional identities are as important as the real world identities.
Right. So what do you think about that, Pigeon? Yeah. So is this only in reference to real world identities? So if there's a bunch of people in a D&D type game or high medieval fantasy game, and you're attacking a group because you just don't like elves, right? That I'm assuming would be very different, than attacking a group because they're Latinos in what you think in real life.
Right. If you had asked me that same question maybe as recently as 3 years ago, I would have said yes in that context. most players, I'm going to air quote it here, would say, I'm just attacking orcs because I don't like orcs, or I'm attacking elves but I don't like elves. But there has been a lot more discourse certainly in tabletop gaming, and some that I'm aware of in World of Warcraft, where there's been a movement away of characterizing certain races in the game as evil, and while others are good.
Right.
Based on the kernel of that, they're sentient beings, and there's a history of associating the evil, darker side with people of color, the beautiful white side, the elves. So as recently as this is within the last month, seeing apologies to listeners, I can't remember the name of the race in Spelljammer, where there were a lot of the artwork, the description matched overcoming slavery in the United States in a very uncanny fashion. Now, to be fair, Wizards of the Coast fixed it overnight when they noticed that. But there's a lot of pushback now in the tabletop gaming community against these hardcore absolutes. Like, why can't an orc be good? Why can't an elf be evil?
Right.
Inside World of Warcraft, same thing. The sense of why is the Horde evil? Like, why are they evil? The game says because players are saying we don't like that anymore. We want something different.
Yeah, it's interesting. So what is the wrong with that? So is the wrong with that we're essentially perpetuating norms that attach goodness or evil to a group simply because of, not to a group, but let's say to a race here, right? Or to anybody with certain natural born characteristics. I don't know how far to expand this, to broaden the category.
Yeah. Right. I've actually struggled with this, both emotionally and academically, and how to overcome this. Because, I mean, I grew up with Dungeons and Dragons and the various electronic formats, electronic fantasy games. I'm a happy Gen Xer and all that. Where I remember, orcs existed primarily because people needed something to kill.
Right.
And they wanted to be able to emotionally separate themselves from it.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's getting more difficult. And I could see this wedge in the tabletop community of orcs are evil and we need that foozle. We need that bad guy. We want a very clear-cut bad guy. Therefore, it is orcs, kobolds, with the other group saying that's problematic because have you ever thought about like what makes them evil? What makes a sentient being pure evil?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because D&D started drifting away from this. They started separating this stuff out 25 years ago with their 3.0 rules. They started saying, all right, this whole good, evil, chaos law thing is more complicated than that and easier to resolve. And they started saying that there weren't things that automatically just by dint of the game design itself made you good or made you evil. And it's been a gradual push into the situation now where people are saying, no, look, there can't be entire races that are just evil races because you need somebody that you can kill on sight without thinking about the moral ramifications of it.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious. So how does zombies fit in here? Right, because
and robots,
right? Zombies and right. So these are kind of our current replacement. You throw Nazis in there, I guess you got it. And if you get an orc Nazi, that might be worse, right? Right. So this idea that these kind of groups are. The Nazis, we just kind of accept, okay, they're evil, which is interesting. First of all, I guess before we get to the other groups, how do Nazis fit in here? Are Nazis essentially, they're not a group, they're a group that have chosen their membership so their membership is, it's okay to use them as our evil enemy because membership has been chosen, even though of course we ignore that is not particularly the case historically?
Oh man, here's another heady one. So as a player, I appreciate that, the idea of the Nazi ideology. So if you have a archetype in the game that represents a Nazi ideology, a persona of the ideology, I will shoot him and cut him up and all that. But you're right. I mean, I teach a course called Comparative Authoritarianism at CSU, and talking about Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, you would have a lot of people in Germany who were not evil. They were not evil, but they didn't have a way to escape the banality of what was going around them, and they would find themselves engaging in activities they would not normally engage in, horrific activities.
Right.
As a person, they were still good, but as a group, when you take them to see the gas chambers or the crematoriums as individuals, they realized the horror of it, but they couldn't separate themselves from the group.
So what do we do with things like that? So notice, right, we have kind of our in-game groups, right? And so yeah, it's interesting because mind you, I mean, with unlike the real world, it seems to me that games do give you a lot of choices about which factions to join, what groups to set up, right? I mean, in the real world, if you were in Germany and you were the right age and everybody around you is adopting a certain view of the reality of life, and bandwagon effect kicks in and all your cognitive biases, it's easy to just kind of adopt that view of the world. In a video game, you have a choice, and okay, so we got to the point where it's wrong to essentially label some groups as evil for what they are. But if we're talking about they're defined by ideology, then it seems that wouldn't be necessarily so bad.
Right. Or what about, if going back to World of Warcraft, you have these two factions that are meant to be in competition to one another. And so choosing a faction puts you in opposition to these other players. And they're easily labeled. You can easily see who is and who isn't part of your faction. In the case of World of Warcraft, I think they do it by race. In fact, your in-character class, your in-character race. There's certain races that are one faction, and then certain races that are the other faction. So it's really visually apparent.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I have an idea of how to get around this, but that World of Warcraft example makes it problematic. My idea is, like, how do you move away from, are all orcs evil or all elves good? It's about motivation. Create the narrative around their motivation. Like, what do they want?
Yeah.
You're at odds because you have cross motivations. Sort of like how a good villain sees themselves as the good guy, like, because they have a strong motivation and why they're trying to do what they're trying to do. So let me take, hopefully I don't mischaracterize it, because my son is always talking to me about Guild Wars 2. I haven't played it yet. He said, Dad, it apparently has a very rich political narrative. So I imagine when I do play it, even though it's a multiplayer game, I'll probably be doing a lot of writing on what the narrative is. But in that case, and maybe World of Warcraft 2, it's guided by the procedural rhetoric of the developer. Like, if the developer says, yes, we are all these players, but we're going to create this narrative in the game based around ideologies and motivations, not race, then it becomes easier for people, I think, to take some sort of moral stand against, like, I don't care that person's an orc, but I do care that they're an aggressive band of thieves that are trying to kill us, because that's a pretty powerful motive to protect yourself. In a pure sandbox game like EVE Online, and then it's just a matter, or at least the nullsec region, excuse me. It still depends on the motivations of the players, like the players generating their own narrative.
Right.
Actually, in a way, though, now that I think about it, a sandbox game makes it slightly easier because it's all kind of based on motives. Like players are going after...
EVE Online is really interesting because it's not clear when you run up against another player there aren't clear factions in the game. There are guilds and there are factions in the game, but they're all player created and not created by the structure of the game itself.
Yeah.
And so there isn't any obvious thing about anybody.
And can't people still backstab each other even within their own guild? So this brings me back to this question of the question of the ethics of the politics that happens here. Right. It's interesting, but I guess before that, I want to go back to, because I see the possibility of choosing factions based on the story of what their motivation is, right, as a group, or based on their political ideology, right? Like, screw those libertarians, right? Or the people that want a strong centralized government, right? We all our avatars have to live together in the world, and every player can choose to join a faction that matches something close to their real world sense of justice, right? Of what would make for a just society. So I to me that sounds like a really two possible solutions that would fit, different possibilities. But to go back to the EVE Online thing now, right? And really kind of to expand the question. Okay, we got one thing out of the way, right? This idea of treating people as groups that are evil, right? Now, what else can you do that is a political action in a game that would be immoral or morally questionable? And we could either talk about backstabbing in EVE Online, or we could go back to other things that you might do in, let's say, World of Warcraft. I mean, crashing someone's funeral, really, that seems wrong to me. But right? Some like that. Yep.
Well, actually, I go back to what you said earlier about like actual theft taking place in games, like creating. Oh, here we go. Yes, here it is. Creating trust with another player, and that's another positive, negative aspect of presence is. People trust things where they can see a face or they can see some identity of the other person. Once they see that, they will eminently trust that person. I mean, that young avatar, female avatar, wearing a skimpy outfit could be a 70-year-old dude in Seattle somewhere. The player sees that and takes it at face value that is actually a young woman. Let's expand that. So now players learn to trust each other, or they think they trust each other in the game. The record is replete with players knowing how to game that trust, pardon the pun, to take real objects of value from other players, escape, then go sell it for real money. That's actual theft of things of value that can be converted into real world currency. That would be a big one.
Though it's interesting, right? I mean, in a game like EVE Online, right, that we usually see that as part of the game itself.
Yes.
Right.
Oh yeah. EVE Online, I would like to say, at least in nullsec, the players know what they're getting. Like, they have signed up for that.
Right.
They might be in for a first. I can't believe that just happened to me. But it's what is in other games where that type of anarchy doesn't exist. Like like something like Guild Wars or. How come I can't think of more examples? This is crazy. Guild Wars, World of Warcraft, maybe Diablo 3 back when they had an actual auction house that you could sell for real things. Basically, think of a game where an object can be converted into an asset, a real world asset.
And there aren't many. CS:GO, Counter-Strike, has that. There aren't many games that can do this, though. Most games keep their economy contained. They don't want people cashing out, basically.
Yeah. Though I think I think really what the point is that seems to come out is that it's not necessarily what you're doing to the other group. but what you're doing in the context of what is expected, uh, accepted behavior, right? So, in a normal context, stealing somebody's assets, right, is considered really wrong. Stealing a group's assets is considered wrong. You know that when you are getting into EVE Online, it's not considered wrong, right? You know that you're going into a world where the norms are different. What do you do when the idea that the norms can be different in different worlds and games are each a different world? Are there any general rules about what we can or can't do with one group to another group? Can I go with my group around World of Warcraft and pick on much weaker groups, for example, and decide to decimate them for fun?
Right. So two schools of thought here. One is, yes, that you'll have the developers will have EULAs in place to say, hey, if you're harassing other players, you're griefing them, you're basically finding ways to ruin your play experience, and you get excess reports on your behavior, you could be banned from the game. Okay, then you just go find another IP to start up again.
Right. And by the way, EULA is End User License Agreement.
Oh, thank you. Yep. The other school of thought, though, and this is where it becomes problematic, is lacking any type of punishment structure. Players can just keep getting away with it. Like, even in a world where it's not supposed to happen, where you have this ideal state that players should behave this way, per procedural rhetoric, players that try to find ways to push the boundaries of the game to fit it to what their play style, and they realize I'm not getting punished for my behavior.
Or just prevented from doing the thing.
Yeah, or prevented from doing the thing. They'll do it.
This is what I've talked about this in previous episodes where I've said, if it's not banned, if it becomes required, in a competitive situation, if it's not outright banned and disallowed in some way, then it becomes required. So that if we're in this highly competitive situation like on EVE Online, going out into nullsec, no security areas and hunting down other players and taking their stuff, that's the game. That is the game.
I don't know if I agree with you on all that. I think EVE might be a very special case. I think there's plenty of competitive situations where sportsmanship is really important. But it's interesting. A part of that really can be, Andy, what is the game?
Yeah, but I mean, think about all these rules. Let's think about sports with sportsmanship rules. They are enforced,
right?
And if they weren't enforced, what would happen?
Well, you could still have sportsmanship without rules that are enforcing it, and sportsmanship might still require you to go beyond the stated rules. Let's not get off topic though.
Sure.
Right? So let's get back to this. Pigeon, let me ask you this. So we've been talking a lot about World of Warcraft, and I remember reading a book by game scholar Miguel Sykart. He had a book, I think in the mid 2000s, called "The Ethics of Computer Games." And essentially, part of what he wrote is he called World of Warcraft a tyrannical government, right? So the idea was that you have all these people that spend a big part of their lives in this world. And at the time, I mean, World of Warcraft was really big, right? And we're talking about people spending, on average, I think 30 hours a week, in the game. But they have no say in the way that society is structured, right? Instead, Blizzard owns the game, makes all the decisions. The players just have to accept them or move on to another game. And he argued that more just game worlds really required greater representation, right? So in a very political sense, that for the game world to be a just world, the players' voices really needed to be heard, and the players needed to be a part of decision making through more democratic institutions. What do you think about that claim, that game worlds that are entirely controlled by the company are tyrannical and unjust?
They are tyrannical in the sense that, yes, the procedural rhetoric of the developer then basically determines what the gameplay experience is for the characters. And if they could make a change in the game that fundamentally alters the play style for everybody. I am 50% sure this anecdote comes from My Life as a Night Elf Priest by Bonnie Nardi, or it could be from, I can't remember the author's name, Values at Play in Digital Games, and I apologize, I can't remember the name off the top of my head. Example of, we keep sticking to World of Warcraft, but this is a great one. They're used to the old travel system in the game would encourage players to gather at certain points where you had to travel. So that if they wanted to engage in any type of cooperative activity, they want to organize events, they wanted to trade goods, they knew if they went to these certain areas in the game that they could always find people. Well, then when the game added more mounts, and we don't need to gather these places anymore. Now you go to the same landmarks in the game and they're desolate. There's nobody there. And that was driven by the developer. So they basically fundamentally destroyed a form of communication inside the game by doing that.
By adding a feature that everybody otherwise wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are games, like let me back up. If the company, the developers is said you are going to play our vision of the game and nothing else, then either players stay or players exit and say, you know what, then I'll find something else. But you will have developers who will actively listen to player feedback and make changes. The risk, of course, they take is that you're going to have vocal minorities, and actually it could be a very sizable minority who are like, that change sucks. That change, I can't believe you did that in the game. So even by taking player feedback and acting on it in good faith, they could still be fundamentally changing the gameplay experience for everybody in such a way, and in such a way they don't even forecast would have happened without all these players exploring it.
And because of that squeaky wheel syndrome, they could be making a change that is on its face unjust because most people don't want it, but they just not the squeaky wheel. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's the complainers.
Oh, I see.
The people who are vocal. The people who are vocal about something are really, really like and in the developer's ear about it all the time. They're the ones that are providing feedback, and they could be the ones they could want something that is on its face unjust for other players.
Right. I see where you're going there, because the way I presented it was kind of an ideal state where they're listening to feedback based on the broad player base. But yes, right. Absolutely, you can get a very ambivalent player base that ends up being governed by changes demanded by a smaller vocal player base.
Right. What about it's interesting because you said on the one hand there is a sort of tyrannical relationship going on here, and on the other hand, that relationship existed when the world was created, let's say. Right. And you bought into it, and if you live like in a tyrannical society, normally you can't leave. Right. I mean, here you can leave. You could join another one. On the other hand, right. I mean, when you spend 1,000 hours in a game and you've invested so much, right. Is there a sense where, it's unjust to treat you just as a sort of visitor that can leave, and that you've earned yourself some sort of naturalization process as someone who should have a voice in how things are run? I'm trying to use these analogies.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to throw on the example of games that are taken offline, like games that fail, like people invest. And then I assure you I'll segue it into the sense of being a digital citizen in this world. Players invest all this time and energy into a game that ultimately fails, and it's like having a death. It's like watching a world destroy itself. And they'll all gather on the last hour to the last minute to the last second of the game, all to be there when it goes to you have been disconnected from the server.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. But anyway, regardless of example, there have been a number of occasions where games have gone online, and the people that were digital citizens feel betrayed by the company. Betrayed by the company.
Right. Do they have a right to? I mean, it's weird, this idea of this digital citizenship, right? That we know that the game will last as long as the game lasts. We know that this probably is not forever. Eventually, I mean, who knows? WoW will probably may make it to the metaverse and live on for years potentially, right? It's possible, right? But it's easy to think. It's pretty easy, I think, to think of people who invested years into a game as really caring about that world. So I go back to that question, right? And I think your example really illustrates how much people can care. Is there something that unjust if they don't have a say in the direction of that world, without some sort of more democratic institution?
On paper, what's unfortunate is, yes, I would agree with that position. Even games that have become so popular, they actually hold conventions where players will gather in real life. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, it is only as democratic as what the developer grants. So you can be there for 1,000, 2,000. You can get married there. You can get this, that, and the other. You can build a business. At the end of the day, your voice is only as valuable as granted by the company.
But don't we all sort of wish that we lived in a benign dictatorship?
There's a lot to say for a benign dictatorship. It's the best.
Right? And in some ways, games offer this opportunity, right? Because game designers, to a certain degree, we're trying to create a world where everybody is having their fun equally, and everybody is treated equally, and so in some ways we are these benign dictators.
I love it. That's great.
Especially if online games that have instances. So yes, there's this overall thousands of players, but each individual has their own narrative that they can basically becomes a solo game that they play through. If that player feels like that their choices matter and something to them changed in the game, then I could see that. Then the benign dictator had that power to make sure that everybody's reality kind of matched what choices they make. Now, someone might stand on a ladder and look on the other side of the other person and go, wait, you're different. You don't have the same experience that I am, and it could actually bring down the facade. But yeah, I think that's the way around it is then having that sense that individual choices matter to that individual's player experience.
Right.
To put a little cynical twist on the benign dictator, because I like that. There's a lot of sense in that, right? The game is essentially designed by an all-powerful dictator that wants people to enjoy the game because that's how they make their money, right? Though ultimately, the second of those is really the primary aim, often, right?
Right, sure.
Right.
Of course.
But supposedly they I want to be a little bit cynical about
and
not forgetting the money part, right?
Because it's so competitive, the more fun, the more engaged, the more happy our players are, the better we're going to do because we're in a competitive market vying for these players. There's always another game that they can go play.
I want to point out too, if we were to go back to the World of Warcraft example, and think about, let's say the players can, because a world like that is scripted, right? So there's a storyline, right? And the company develops a storyline. If the players start having democratic institutions, possibly they can vote on storylines, but possibly they can create chaos, which will not make a good storyline possible and make things worse for everybody because mobs, democracy itself has a mob mentality that can turn bad.
There's actually a term for this that I use in comparative authoritarianism. It's called feckless pluralism, which is a fancy way of saying It's not an authoritarian regime, but there's so much churn in the democratic process that nothing happens. It's like it's a form of gridlock that is caused by the voters putting people in office and not by the people in office themselves. It causes a lot of cynicism that, okay, nothing's getting done. So I think the example you're presenting there is you have now all these competing agendas, all these competing actors in the game. And when I say actor, I'm talking about not just the individual players, but the groups themselves, all trying to present different ideas of way things they ought to be in the game. But and at the end of the day, then it ends up ruining the playing experience for everybody.
Right.
Yeah, I should point out that vampire game that I was in that I talked about earlier collapsed pretty quickly after us trying to rewrite the rules on the fly.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for things to work, a lot of times we need stability, right? I mean, without stability, societies, disintegrate. Let's move on now to more like the real world. Some games like Jesus Strikes Back. Are you familiar with Jesus Strikes Back?
I'll be honest. I thought my repertoire was pretty good, but I had not heard of it. Yeah.
I heard about it from one of our guests. It's a fun one. It's essentially you go around killing liberals, immigrants, LGBTQ people, feminists, and you can play as either Jesus or Trump, right? So a game like that, brings real world politics into the game world. And another example, a positive example, really, in my opinion, would be the game Peacemaker, right, which simulates the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think it's just a fantastic game, educates players on really both sides. It puts you, we've talked about in this program before, puts you in the position of the Palestinian president or Israeli prime minister. Are there ways that you think games like this can use real-world politics unethically?
Yes, particularly if it affects how they behave in the real world. So take, what was that, Jesus? What was the name of the game again?
Jesus Strikes Back.
Jesus Strikes Back. So somebody who's already, no value judgments to listeners here, but some QAnon Tea Party, like I hate this, that, and the other, can actively carry out their anger inside this game, and it makes them feel good, and it reinforces their ideas of how things ought to be. There is that latent risk that then they come out and it reinforces their actual hate and rage in their political activity outside of the game.
As would any other form of entertainment that also reinforce their ideas. Right.
Or specifically value systems. Right. So we're not talking about something. We're not talking about something akin to, let's say, the violence issues.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. I did that. Yeah. Let me clarify. I am on the side of academia that says video games do not necessarily lead to violence. Like just because someone kills, thousands of creatures in a game or plays Call of Duty doesn't make them any more likely outside of the game. But if now what I'm getting at is if the narrative of the game is designed around the idea of reinforcing something, let's call it the serious games and persuasive games, like they have been purposely designed to task to bring people into specific echo chambers or bring them into specific ideologies.
And so there's some games that have been made purely for entertainment purposes that also do this. I was thinking there was a SWAT game. There was a game that you played, these SWAT police officers in some sort of, fictionalized inner city where, it was just you were the law and you could do whatever you wanted, and you were sent on missions and busting down doors and shooting people in the street, and all of that was part and parcel of the game. And that's not, they didn't mean that. I'm sure they didn't make that game to make a political point.
Oh, I see. Yeah, the same America's Army might be in that same genre.
Although in that case they were using that as a recruiting tool, right?
But it's a recruiting that essentially gives you that enhances a certain perspective of what's important in the world, and the military is supposed to play a really important role in society.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, that persuasive divide not persuasive,
rhetorical.
Come on, pigeon. I can think of the word. Purposeful. That's what I want to say. That purposeful design, like explicit design. That's where it can lead to unethical behavior, or at least reinforce it if it already exists, if you will.
Right.
So in this case, we're looking at anything that essentially supports norms that are bad for us, bad for society at least.
Yeah. Although I'm not sure why we should be separating intentional and unintentional.
Yeah, I didn't have the intentional in there, but
Pigeon, you did.
But Pigeon did.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I would agree. Like there's another SWAT game that just came out. Oh, anyway, there was, when it was first released, there was a lot of pushback on it, some controversy, in that at face value it did appear like, yes, you were just playing professionally trained police going into these very difficult situations. Except some of these difficult situations were like going into a gay bar and actually having the images of a gay bar everywhere, and it was seen as an attack, gay bashing, an attack on homosexuals, or attacks on prostitutes, attacks on, like, yes, this could be a violent crime, but what about all these other drug addicts that are laying around? Are you going to kill them or are you not going to kill them? Ready or Not. That's the name of the game. Ready or Not. I think my understanding is, as they've gone on in development, they've actually thought about these things. Like, we want it to be, when it comes to intentional design, they do want it to have a sense of being more emotionally charged than you're just going through another pattern of rescuing a hostage. They want you to think you're looking around you and going, what other societal effects are around me? So,
by the way, I still think that it's really important to recognize with any of these games that touch on, socially important groups like the police, like the military, that it seems to me that if you are presenting those groups ethically, you really are thinking about the social impact that that you could have in terms of the values that you are promoting, in terms of what's appropriate for those groups to do.
Yeah. Actually, it's something I appreciate about America's Army that I think is overlooked is, some viewers might look at it and go, oh, that's just propaganda for the U.S. military. You actually play it, it teaches you that this is for real. You get hit. This is not Call of Duty where you get revived at the end. You die in this. Mm-hmm. So it's showing the kind of really stark clarity of this is what you're getting into if you do this.
To some extent, right? It's still taking very much a pro-American view. The Army is right, right. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting, right? That there is a step of responsibility there to at least not mischaracterize, what is going on there. All right, Pigeon. Last question. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the two worst words, the worst phrase in the English language is grow up. So don't take away, anytime play, games, and creativity are taken away, we become less human. So go out there and play a game right now. Go play Skyrim, go play World of Warcraft. It matters to humanity. Yeah.
All right. It matters to humanity. I love it. All right. Good podcast, guys.
Sweet.
Thanks for being on the show, Pigeon. Play nice, everybody. Yay!
Sweet.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.